Yale Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Quadcast, a Yale Divinity School podcast series focusing on issues related to religion and politics. In this episode, Emily Judd interviews Rabbi Jason Rubenstein, the Jewish chaplain at Yale University. Rabbi Rubenstein argues that Jewish sacred texts outside of the Bible are key to understanding modern Jewish practice and theology.
The central texts of Jewish life, both for study and for practice nowadays, really focus on the Talmud, the rabbinic canon, which is sprawling.
He explains the differences between the idea of Messiah in Judaism as compared to Christianity.
Jewish messianism is very much tied to a transformation of the material conditions of human life, the end of war, the end of poverty and hunger.
And Rabbi Rubenstein discusses the uniqueness of Judaism in America.
There's always been a kind of a pluralism, or one might call it anarchy, to American Judaism, which has never been the case elsewhere in the world.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Rabbi Rubenstein. I'm personally very excited about this episode because we've not had an episode focused solely on Judaism in our 4 seasons of the Quadcast. We have previously had an episode on Jewish-Christian dialogue with a Jewish rabbi, but like I said, it was not solely about Judaism. Many non-Jewish people are familiar with the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Can you talk a bit about the other sacred texts in Judaism and their roles?
The Bible has a pride of place, the Chumash, as we call it, which means the 5-sectioned book. It's written scribally. It takes about a year of work to make one. The ones that are in our synagogues are still written on vellum by hand, and they have to be maintained in kind of climate-controlled settings. And can last, well over a century when done well. And they're treated with great respect. Also, in their scroll form, they're never left alone. They're always lifted to be transported.
Also, you can't throw it out, right? There's something called a geniza.
Exactly. And that applies to a much broader scope of sacred writings, including prayer books and some other things that are printed. And then, the rest of, it's called the Bible. We call the Tanakh, which is a 3-letter acronym for Torah, which is the 5 books. Which means teaching, Nevi'im, the prophetic books, and then Ketuvim, the writings, which would include Psalms, Proverbs, the wisdom literature, etc., Esther. And so those forms like the kind of the core of the canon. And the central texts of Jewish life, both for study and for practice nowadays, really focus on the Talmud, the rabbinic canon, which is sprawling. It has its own kind of history, really kind of paralleling in time the church fathers and in space also in a lot of ways. If you wanted to kind of understand contemporary Jewish practice and Jewish kind of theology, you would start more centrally at the Talmud. Things like, one of the classic examples, and something Judaism shares with Christianity, right? The drinking of wine on Friday nights as part of the beginning of the Sabbath. There's nothing remotely like that in the Torah and the entire Bible. Human beings never drink wine in a religiously significant event. Libations to God are the only ones of those. Whereas the Talmud assumes that a part of the observance of Sabbath and the Passover Seder and other things involves the celebratory consumption of wine. And those kinds of things you would find in the Talmud, not in the Torah or any earlier.
What are some of the divisions in modern Judaism today, specifically the U.S. and the United States?
So classically, the great division within Jewish life is actually not ideological in any way, shape, or form, but Jews who are living under Christianity versus Jews who are living under Islam, and not versus. There was a lot of actually correspondence, commerce, exchange, but there are obviously different cultural, theological, legal milieus they're living in. And so those produce large differences and kind of fascinating and very rich ones, obviously cuisine and music as well. And those are actually alive and well today in Israel and in America. The term generally for Jews come from kind of living in Christian lands is Ashkenazi versus Sephardi, even though neither of those terms is very precise for those who come from Muslim lands. So nowadays in America, the way that I would narrate American Jewish history and denominations, which is, everyone's narration is makes choices, is the kind of the early layers of American Judaism were Reform. Really, kind of the American Jewish community, there were Spanish Portuguese elements and German elements, but in the late 19th century, the only Judaism in America is a Reform Judaism.
And what is the Reform Judaism?
Right, so it's really an embrace of taking in the best of European culture and shedding a lot of the kind of traditionally distinctive and Jewish practices, clothing, ways of wearing hair, dietary laws that had the function and sometimes even the intent of preserving real, separateness for the Jewish community, and the endogamy, the prohibition on intermarriage, probably obviously being the most charged of these. So the Reform community is the American Jewish community. This is why their rabbinic group is called the Central Conference of American Rabbis. And their first prayer book, Jewish prayer book that's printed, is called Minhag America, the American Rite. And there wasn't a sense of it being right. This was the practice here. And then in the early 20th century, you get a large stream of Eastern European immigrants who bring socialism and bring Yiddish and bring you think of maybe the character of Tevye. And then after World War II is when you get a large immigrant population from Poland and Lithuania and Hungary who bring what we would identify today as kind of an ultra-Orthodoxy that's centered really deeply on a kind of a highly scrupulous practice of the commandments, an intensive focus on the Talmud and a mastery of it in a, almost kind of a totalizing of the entirety of the curriculum. And that begins to have interesting effects on the rest of the American Jewish community. But I think kind of you can see in these different kind of historical layers and different geographic origins and traditions, the underlying kind of templates of different kind of types of spirituality, which persist to today.
So I'm wondering if you could just give an example just to demonstrate maybe the difference between Reform and ultra-Orthodox, like you said, in terms of the Sabbath. Shabbat, what are the differences between how a Reform Jewish person would, commemorate the Sabbath and someone who is ultra-Orthodox?
So, and it's a good, Shabbat, as we call it, is always a helpful window into just these questions. And I want to preface everything I'm saying. Obviously, there's a great deal of diversity within every Jewish movement. So, a Reform synagogue, people would generally drive to on Shabbat. I'll kind of list point by point the distinctions rather than kind of laying them out. Whereas in a more observant community, not just an ultra-Orthodox one, driving is one of the kind of central prohibitions on Shabbat, which means that people would only walk and would therefore live in a geographically dense community. Then the service itself would also look quite different. The Reform service would incorporate a significant amount of English. The prayers would be recited responsively, and may vary significantly week to week. Whereas in a more traditional and not only ultra-Orthodox setting, the service would be basically exclusively in Hebrew. The sermon may be in English, also maybe in Yiddish. And then the kind of the praxis of Shabbat is, in an observant setting, right? There's no food, there's no cooking. So all food preparation has to happen beforehand. There's no use of electricity or fires. So lights have to be set. Oftentimes timers are used so the lights will turn off or hot plates will turn on. Coffee has to be ground beforehand and hot water urns have to be set up beforehand. And as people don't go to work. And so the set of leisure activities on Shabbat, you wouldn't go to the beach necessarily. You would spend time with the community, whether it's studying, whether it's the kids playing together. It tends to be people are obviously off of screens, so it tends to be like a very feels kind of pre-modern in a certain way. And I will share. So I've visited ultra-Orthodox communities, never lived in them. I grew up Reform, spent some time in more liberal Orthodox settings, and my ordination is conservative. But I will share one of my favorite moments was from a student in a program I used to teach in and do admissions who said he himself was living a kind of observant and modern life, saying, I don't understand what the point of Shabbat was before social media. That the kind of force of a rule that will keep you and your friends and family and community off of their devices for 25 hours is extremely powerful. And part of the reason I bring that up is there's often a sense that the traditions are ancient, because they are, and it can be hard to capture the ways that they take on new meanings in modernity and post-modernity. I just wanted to show that as a really delightful vignette of one of the ways they do.
The same terms and concepts have different meanings in Judaism and Christianity. For example, Sabbath, covenant, Messiah. Can you explain the figure of the Messiah in Judaism, and what is the key difference between the Messiah in Judaism and Christianity?
Great. It's a great question. So I think the key difference, the term Mashiach in Hebrew means anointed one. It's actually a broad term. There are many people who are anointed in the Torah and elsewhere. The main difference is in terms of scope, right? The messianism is at the very center. It is, in some level, what Christianity is, right? So the word Christ itself, and is a concept in Judaism, but it is never the central one, and it's always a more fraught one. And so that's, I think, the first is a kind of a foreground versus a background distinction, and then the second one, which is perhaps a little bit more obvious, is that Christianity claims that the Messiah and the figure of Christ Jesus has come and redeemed the world, and for Judaism, it's a future-oriented expectation, hope, or fantasy. And I think that kind of the deepest piece of this is that Jewish messianism is very much tied to a transformation of the material conditions of human life, the end of war, the end of poverty and hunger. And that there is, it's very clear that any claims to a messianic career that don't deliver this worldly transformation for the Jewish people, the world as a biological and organic entity, and the world as a human political entity, are not even to be entertained.
Is there anything that's distinctive about Judaism in America as opposed to Judaism around the world, let's say in Israel?
Yeah, so American Judaism is the liberal movements, we call them Reform and the conservative movements, are much more prominent here than anywhere else in the world. And I think that relates back to the history I was telling of the 19th century. There's never been an established Judaism here, and unlike in British, Ottoman, and because of that, Israel, countries like Israel, there's a chief representative of the Jews to the government, who's always been an Orthodox rabbi. Actually, in British Palestine, today there are two, actually, an Ashkenazi one and a Sephardi one, as we discussed, but not a Reform, Reconstructionist, or conservative one. There were attempts to have a chief rabbi of New York, which failed, kind of went down in flames, I would say, in the early 20th century. And so there's always been a kind of pluralism, or one might call it anarchy, to American Judaism, which has never been the case elsewhere in the world.
Interesting. My last question is actually going back to the Torah. One of the 10 commandments is to refrain from taking the Lord's name in vain. Can you describe a bit about the significance of God's name in Judaism?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the way I would formulate is God's name is understood as a kind of precious gift that one has to treat with reverence and respect. And so the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, is seen as the kind of most personal and direct one, and that's why it's never pronounced directly. There's a tradition, actually, the one time it was pronounced in its original form was by the high priest in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. And that it's made a kind of deafening resonance throughout all of Jerusalem. And so nowadays we use other monikers. I mean, there are many different names for God in the Bible, and there are new ones that are generated, the Merciful One, et cetera, over time, the Ancient of Days, that one's from the book of Daniel, but beautiful ones that kind of the Holy Blessed One, which kind of come up over time. And there have been new feminist ones, the Font of Life, et cetera. And so there's a kind of a generative sense of God transcending each and every name, although the names do kind of in some ways, partake of some of God's sanctity.
So in Jewish prayer, there would be no mention of God's name. It would be one of the names that you just said as it's even for the sanctity, I'm not going to pronounce it right now, but the translates as my master is how we refer to God, even though it's printed in the prayer books as the Tetragrammaton without vowels, which is why they have that sacred status and go to the Geniza, as you described. But that name is not pronounced. Interesting. Okay. I had no idea. I didn't know that. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think the discussion was very beneficial for all of our listeners. So thank you.